students from within the university and those of you who've taken a trek to come to Regent's Park this evening. Thank you very much for coming. Seminars like this are nothing without the audiences, so thank you. I just wanted to say 2 or 3 words about the Institute of Contemporary European Studies, and more importantly about the senior European experts. A few years ago, our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Cooper, who's here, had this concept that we're global, but we're also European, and one of our institutes should be an Institute for European Contemporary Studies. And we seek to build on the existing resources of research and expertise within the university, and more important, discover and develop networks from outside. And we publish papers, and indeed the paper this evening will be published, thanks to the European Commission, will be published about our discussion, our findings today, with the report, which has been written by the senior European experts. Now, those of you who don't know the senior European experts, I really commend not them to particularly, although I know them well, but particularly I commend to you what they write, because many of them have been ambassadors in Brussels, in the United Nations, and other parts of Europe, and some of them have been head of the diplomatic service or held high posts in Brussels. And so their papers, which are well thought through, well researched, discussed, produced, and then 3 times a year we work with them to have seminars like this. So first of all, thank you for coming. Secondly, that's enough from me. And what we intend to do is to ask a person who is very involved with the development of the paper, Graham Avery, to speak. Then the other 2 distinguished guests will speak. I won't introduce them because you have in your papers their background, what they've done, and I think it's necessary for us to get on with the proceedings. So first of all, thank you for coming, and secondly, we want to look at the title of what we're doing today, which is the UK and the European Union, are there alternatives to membership? And you will have the paper. If you want it afterwards, you can have it electronically, and it will in due course be published. So may I call upon Graham Avery to address us.
Thank you very much, John, for that introduction. Let me say a little bit more about the senior European experts. As you said, we are former public officials. We prepare briefing papers on European Union questions. Most of our members are ex-diplomats who serve in senior positions in foreign office. For example, Lord Hannay, who's chairman, is here tonight. Others, like me, are persons who worked in the European institutions. I worked for the European Commission in Brussels for 30 years. And there are other colleagues from the senior experts, senior European experts here tonight. One person who isn't here is our Secretary Nick Kent, who's not well tonight. And I want to say that he's the author of this excellent document to which I contributed a few words. I think it's correct to say that our group has no party political affiliation. What unites us is a concern that better, clearer information is needed in the British debate on the European Union. I think it's fair also to say that as former public officials, we speak from experience, not theory or ideology. Anyway, in my brief introduction, I want to address 3 things. First, why do we in our group think this question of alternatives to EU membership is important and needs to be examined? Secondly, I will briefly summarize what we say in our paper, which you've all got it in front of you, you can read it. And I want to finish by saying one of the things that aren't in our paper, which I think are also important. So why is this question of alternatives to EU membership important? Well, obviously, it's because the idea of an in-out referendum on British membership is on the table and is actively supported by several parts of the political spectrum and by public opinion in general. But the problem is this: if there's going to be a referendum, on what basis are the British people expected to vote? What would yes mean? What would no mean? And from the political point of view, we have almost no answer to these questions. The position of the European Independence Party is at least unambiguous. They tend to say that Britain outside the European Union would be self-governing, would be free, and so on. This is all very well for a song and a slogan, but it's not a serious basis for public policy. The position of the Conservative Party is more equivocal. Some of them say that unless there are reforms, we should leave. But they haven't yet, as a party, defined clearly what reforms they want. Even less have they defined what they think the alternatives to membership are. Some of the Conservatives say they want the Norwegian model or the Swiss model, while Mr. Cameron seems to say that neither of these will suit. Others in the Conservative Party, such as Boris Johnson, argue that Britain needs to express its willingness to leave the European Union in order to maximise its leverage in negotiations on better terms of membership. And this position, towards which Mr. Cameron sometimes seems to veer, makes it all the more necessary for us to understand what leaving the EU really means. Now let me summarize very briefly what our paper says. First, we look at the members of the European Free Trade Area. Most of its existing members, that's Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, are in the European Economic Area, the EEA, which gives them privileged access to the European single market in return for applying single market rules. Now, the EEA is the closest relationship that the EU has with non-member countries, short of membership. And it has some attractions. I mean, you don't have to apply the common agricultural policy. You don't have to apply large parts of the fisheries policy. It has some serious drawbacks to membership of the EEA. First, members of the EEA pay a contribution to the EU budget. Norway pays quite a lot. Second, they have no effective say in the decisions on the EU rules that apply to them. And the Norwegians are quite frank about this. As you can read in our paper, Fred Sejersted, a Norwegian professor who led the report to the Norwegian government on the EEA, he described the EEA as, quote, a great democratic deficit, unquote. A spokesman for the Norwegian Conservative Party was rather more brutal. He said, if you want to run the EU, stay in the EU. If you want to be run by the EU, feel free to join us in the EEA, unquote. Would the British House of Commons accept that as an alternative to British membership? I don't think so. Anyway, this disagreeable truth about the Norwegian model, the EEA model, has led some analysts to prefer the Swiss model. Now, after the Swiss people voted in a referendum in 1992 against membership of the EEA, the country made a series of bilateral deals with the European Union on a whole range of issues, altogether 120 bilateral agreements. For Switzerland, unlike for Norway, EU rules don't apply automatically, they only apply to individual agreements. It sounds good, doesn't it? But in reality, the truth is that in order to get access to the single market, Switzerland has been obliged to accept a whole lot of Brussels decisions, and more important, the EU has become increasingly frustrated with the Swiss model and has told Switzerland quite clearly that it wants a more automatic system, something more like the EEA. So, in our view, if Britain left the European Union and asked for a special relationship with the European Union, it's very unlikely that the EU would offer the Swiss solution. Before I leave Norway and Switzerland, I want to say a couple of things. Are there any Swiss or Norwegians here? Well, anyway, I just want to say that these two countries are, of course, stable, prosperous countries, comfortable places to live. Unlike the Swiss and the Norwegians, during my time in Brussels, I was responsible for relations with them. They're nice people and they're good Europeans. But there is a crucial difference between them and this country. The United Kingdom is a big state with a global outreach. They are small states, only a tenth of our size, And they've always understood perfectly well that in matters of economics and trade, they have no option but to fall in line with what their bigger neighbours say and do. By contrast, the British people and the British Parliament would be consternated to be presented with a treaty on leaving the European Union, which required them to give the EU a major say over British law without any representation in the decision-making. The second point I want to make about the year is this, and this is a killer point. If you consider that the main advantage for Britain leaving the European Union is to regain sovereign control over immigration, well, think again. For all the EFTA countries, the EU has made it clear that the free movement of persons from other member states is an essential part of the deal. And it's quite unrealistic to suppose that Britain outside the EU would get different terms. Now, in our paper, we examined some other options. I'm going to mention them, not describe them. We mentioned the idea of a free trade area with the Commonwealth. We mentioned the idea of Britain trading with the European Union and other countries simply under the World Trade Organization rules. And we also mentioned the idea of Britain being part of the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement. Basically, in our paper, we say that these ideas are either risky or disadvantageous. So our conclusion is simply this. If Britain wants unfettered access or privileged access to the single market and the ability to influence the single market, there is no satisfactory alternative to EU membership. Let me conclude by mentioning a few things that aren't in our paper, but which I think are important. The European Union is not just a single market. It's always been more than a trade market. It has policies in many other areas which have economic implications, but are not economic policies. The European Union is about finding common solutions to common problems in areas such as justice and home affairs, energy supply, the environment, climate change, counterterrorism, security, and foreign policy. To put it in one word, it's also about values as well as economics. As David Miliband recently wrote in an excellent publication of Charles Grant's Institute, Miliband wrote, "We need to translate our values," he means social values, of social justice, economic empowerment, and environmental sustainability onto an agenda at the European level. As a member of the EU, Britain plays an important role in shaping and benefiting from these other policies. And as a non-member, it would be, well, outside. Let me conclude with two concrete examples. First, from the environment, and second, from foreign policy. And here I want to mention the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, which with more than 1 million members is Europe's largest voluntary environmental organisation. In its evidence to the government's Balance of Competencies review, the RSPB said, shared natural resources such as biodiversity, air, carbon stores and water require a cross-border approach, and the EU competencies for agriculture, land management and plant health are clearly justified. End of quote. The last point I want to mention is foreign policy. As most of you probably noticed, Richard Sheriff, a British soldier who retired last year as Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, he recently warned that, I quote, "Ukraine is the most serious crisis to have faced Europe since the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. There is a threat of total war," unquote. Now, so far, I think many of us would have agreed with it. And then he went on to say some things where I wouldn't agree. He said in this context, where is Britain? Where is Cameron? Nobody's taking any notice of him. He's a foreign policy irrelevance, unquote. Now, for me, what is interesting is not what the gentleman said, it's what the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister replied. The Foreign Secretary, Philip Hammond, said, quote, Britain has been throughout a key player in the European Union's sanctions regime, which is applying the pressure. That's why the Russians are talking at all, because of the pressure. It's Britain, along with the Netherlands in particular, who pressed for the hardest possible sanction regime. Prime Minister David Cameron added, Britain will continue to play a key role in the EU, making sure we keep the pressure up and keep the pressure on, unquote. Could there be a better demonstration of how in this difficult and critical situation, Britain's membership of the European Union gives us access to essential levers of power? If Britain were to be outside the EU, would our political leaders have any chance of exercising the same influence? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. That's a very good start to our evening. And we asked straight away Martin Wolf, who's the Chief Economics Commentator at Financial Times, very well known to many of you, I think, and many of you will have read his article this morning in the Financial Times to show that he's right up to date. And I asked him what he was going to talk about as a follow-up, and he said, well, I'll think about it when I hear the first speaker. So, Martin.
So thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and an honour to have been invited. I think you're not going to get as much diversity of opinion as you ought to get in a discussion on a topic of this kind, but with me you'll certainly get something more emphatic, because I'm not a former bureaucrat. Well, I was, but it's 35 years ago, and I got rid of that part of my life with immense pleasure, and mainly in order to have the enormous pleasure of saying exactly what I think. So I'm going to make one overall comment, and then I'm going to make 7 points. There's always a long list with me, so you have to concentrate. The overall point I want to make is there are alternatives, and they're all much, much worse. And that's really important. Now, the points I want to make. Number one, as has already been mentioned, this is really an important topic. The decision that we won't discuss right now the probability of a referendum, that might come up in questions, but if we do get to a referendum, the decision that the people of this country will make will, in my view, be of immense importance for the future of the country, not only for, and here I agree completely with the first speaker, not only for purely economic reasons, which might in fact be less significant, but rather for what it says about who the British think they are. And one of the things I think that will be affected by this, and I just mentioned this in passing, is whether the Union itself survives, because I don't think Scotland will go out with us, or needs not for very long. So it's a very, very important issue for the future of Britain, and whether it wishes to be a moderately significant, but still very, very moderately significant offshore island. The second point I would like to make, and I think it's very, very important, is that in my view this referendum is reckless, foolish, and utterly unnecessary. There was no need to have such a referendum. Indeed, my general view is we're having far too many referenda anyway. This never used to be part of the British Constitution. For a very good reason, we thought referenda, until relatively recently, the 70s, were the tool of despots, and they frequently have been used as such. Of course, that's not the case in this example, but if you are going to have a referendum, there needs to be a clear choice over a clear issue that you can hope the electorate will understand. And for reasons and there's something that has happened, or might happen, to which we are going to have to respond. But there is no change in the EU treaties on offer, no significant change in our position on offer. There is absolutely no reason, in my view, to have this referendum, and for reasons I'll come to in a second, in a later point, I think that one of the big problems is the electorate will have structurally and fundamentally no idea what they're voting on. And that's not just the electorate in general, it'll be true for me, all of us. We will not know what we are voting on when we are asked on this in and out vote, because we will have no idea what the out would mean. So that's the second point. The third point I wanted to make, since this is discussed very well in this admirable paper, I won't go into it in detail, is the all alternatives are worse. But on this I'd like to make a general point which might synthesize or sort of provide a framework within which we can think about those choices of all alternatives are worse. So the way to think about it is the more we try to stay inside the economic envelope of the EU, while not being inside the EU, that is to say, legally part of the EU, the better will be our market access, but the smaller will be our freedom of policy decision, and the smaller will be our say on the decisions we have to implement. That's the general structure of this. So if we go into, and this is an example that was given, into the European Economic Area, we can get out of the cap and the common fisheries policy, we would be in the single market, we would have all the rules, including on immigration we hate so much, and we would have no say whatsoever on any of those rules, because we wouldn't be at the table. Fundamentally, we would not be at the table. This is the facts relationship the Norwegians refer to. Now, if you go out of the single market, go into some other more distant relationship, possibly a pure free trade area, or a structure of separate bilateral relationships, you can try and tailor-make this, but of course we will be less and less inside the system. We would lose substantial parts of the benefits of our access the more outside we are. Now there's one particular aspect of this I'd just like to mention. One of the arguments indeed has been put forward is that if we could get outside the EU, we could have free trade areas with NAFTA, India and so forth. On that I'm absolutely clear. Our chances of getting free trade areas with these countries from within the EU, viz. TTIP, right now, are infinitely greater than on our own, because the EU has serious market options to offer the North Americans, the Indians, the Chinese, whoever else, and we on our own don't. So the idea that we would do better in free trade area negotiations outside the EU seems to me completely absurd. And then a final point on this is a sub-point of three. We're not Iceland or Norway or Switzerland, as we pointed out, we want a say. But there is a more important point here that above all, while we discussed all these options, the EEA, the EFTA option, and so forth, options of being in the EU, we don't know at this stage, have no idea what our counterparts in the EU will be prepared to offer. We might want any of these, but they might offer something completely different, or they might just say, go away. And I'll come to that in a minute. The fourth point I would like to make is the disadvantages of EU membership have been grotesquely exaggerated. For example, there's constant complaints about the rigidity of our labour market as a result of EU regulation. Although one thing this crisis has shown us, I can discuss this greater length, is that we retain an incredibly flexible labour market, despite EU regulation. And indeed, the OECD has consistently noted that, better or worse, we can discuss that, Britain has an extraordinarily flexible labour market. None of this is constrained by our membership of the EU. The fifth point I'd like to make, and this is just coming towards the end, is, as I said, that the electorate won't know the alternatives at the time of the referendum. So here what you have to understand is we're going to have some sort of negotiation, nobody knows on what terms, because the government has never said it in any detail, at the end of which there will or will not be some sort of agreement with other EU members, which will be put to the referendum. Let us suppose we then vote we want to leave. That's when the negotiation starts. That is when the negotiation starts. All the questions that are raised. And until we start the negotiation, we will actually have no idea what leaving means. That just underlines this problem about all these alternatives. And of course, sixth, these negotiations will be fantastically complicated, because there are so many possible options here. And we know that we will be having this negotiation with a bunch of countries in the EU which have a lot of much bigger, much more important, much more worrying problems like relations with Russia and the difficulties in the Eurozone, and the anger in the rest of the EU about Britain's performance in these areas recently is palpable and dramatic. Why we think that they're going to be cooperative, I have no idea. It's fantasy land. And the final, and then of course at the end of these negotiations, if whatever deal we do will have to be ratified. That'll be fun. And the final point to make, which brings me back to the starting point, we have this unnecessary referendum which is going to launch us, for the reasons I've explained, on a period of pervasive and ongoing uncertainty about our economic relationships with our most important market. It will remain our most important market for the foreseeable future, and our political position in the world. And this uncertainty could last well beyond a parliamentary term, and it will have significant consequences. So in all, I think we are making a staggering mess of this entire relationship. Thank you.
One of the big issues that pro-Europeans, anti-Europeans go on about is regulation. They make a very strong case that they try to, that leaving the EU is necessary because, as Douglas Carswell says, we are shackled to a corpse, an over-regulated, bloated, declining economy that has very little future, and that to liberate ourselves as a buccaneering, swashbuckling, Singapore-like economy, we just need to get out of these rules and regulations. But I would like to contend that that's a myth, because there's a lot of rules and regulations we'd have to accept anyway. One, look at financial regulation. The City of London is turning against the EU, as the FT reported yesterday, because of all the financial regulations out of Brussels. Most of them are actually implementing global regulations agreed on by the Financial Stability Board, which Brussels is then sort of subcontracted for. So even if we leave the EU, we still have to accept most of these regulations. Look at the environment. If we leave the EU, would the British people really want to get rid of the regulations on air quality, drinking water quality, bathing water quality? As agriculture, Norway and Switzerland have bigger agricultural subsidies than we do in the EU, and I cannot believe that our farmers will tolerate leaving the EU and not getting very similar subsidies to the subsidies they get today. Of course, the Conservative Party's gone on about social regulation in the EU, and the Working Time Directive in particular. But actually, would the British people really want to be without the norms set by the EU in terms of non-discrimination, in terms of 4 weeks paid holiday a year, the 48-hour working week, which Britain has some opt-outs out of, and so on. My guess is any British government would have to maintain very similar regulations anyway. Martin has already mentioned the OECD rankings of its members, which are the rich economies, for product markets and labour markets, how strictly regulated they are. Well, the Central European Reform, we published this report, the economic consequences of leaving the EU, last summer. Martin was a member of the Commission which drew up this report, and it can be downloaded from the CR's website for free. I would particularly point you, those of you who want to download it, to pages 44 and 45, where there are tables of how Britain compares to other countries with the intensity of regulation. Of all the OECD members, only the Netherlands has more liberal product and labour market regulations. We are, in Britain, we have less regulations than the US, Australia, and let alone the other EU countries, apart from the Netherlands. The same for labour markets. We have comparable labour market regulations to the US, Canada, and New Zealand, but Australia and all the other member states of the EU have strict regulations, for better or for worse. I mean, the real answer to Douglas Carswell's point is look at Germany. I mean, Germany is shackled to a corpse too, apparently. But Germany manages to export massively well to China. In fact, half of all the EU's exports to China are from Germany. And Britain doesn't do very well with China. There's a tiny percentage of EU exports to China are British. So whatever's wrong, it's not the EU regulations. In fact, another OECD report, also quoted in this little book, looks at what is wrong with the British economy, the various supply-side constraints. They are almost all homegrown. There's our planning rules, which Martin has written about. I don't share his enthusiasm for concreting over the green belt, but nevertheless he has a point in pointing out that Britain's planning rules do lead to very high house prices, very high rents, very small houses, and so on, and are a real constraint on economic activity, and Martin's right about that. Secondly, our transport infrastructure is creaking and inadequate. Thirdly, our secondary schools are not particularly good by international standards. They're not the worst either, but if you look at literacy and numeracy of 15-year-olds, we come out in the EU average, so that's a constraint. And then, of course, our vocational training is famously not particularly good at all. So these are some of the shackles holding back on economy, and they're homegrown. The real point which Graham and Martin have already made is that if we want access to the single market, we have to accept its rules. And this, I would say, to put it this way, there is essentially a spectrum between regulatory sovereignty and access to the market. You can be like Norway and have very good access to most parts of the single market and absolutely no regulatory sovereignty at all. The Norwegians have to accept single market rules made in Brussels. They're consulted on them but don't have a vote on them. At the other end of the spectrum, you have a country like China, which has very limited access to the single market but isn't obliged to follow EU rules, although of course if it wants to export into the EU market, it has to follow EU product standards. So that if Britain leaves the EU, it has to choose a position on this spectrum. Now, the one criticism I'd make of the Graham's report and the expert group is that they don't talk about what I think is the most likely option for Britain if it leaves the EU, which is an FTA. I mean, it's for the reasons that others have explained, I think, and I'll say something more on, the Norwegian and Swiss models really don't work for Britain. So what would happen is, as with Japan or Korea or the US, there'd be a negotiation of an FTA between Britain and the EU, I would guess. And we could probably then get rid of some tariff barriers, but we would have to accept EU social norms, EU environmental rules, EU health and safety rules, EU competition rules, or our partners would not give us access to their market, and we'd have to accept their product standards too. We would not have full access to the single market, just like for the same reason that America will not have full access to the single market if the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership is negotiated. Now, a lot of Eurosceptics say, well, they'd have to give us a fantastic deal because they need us so much more than we need them. Because, according to the Eurosceptics, Britain has a big trade deficit with the EU, so therefore the EU countries are desperate to maintain their access to Britain's markets for their car exports and so on. Actually, it is true that Britain has a manufacturing trade deficit with the EU, it has a services trade surplus. But I'd actually say our bargaining position is much weaker than the sceptics suggest, because roughly half of Britain's exports go to the EU, roughly. Therefore, we really need that market badly. While how many of the Eurozone's exports go to the UK? It's about 10%. They need it, but not that badly. So in terms of bargaining power, we shouldn't exaggerate. And there's also the issue of precedent. If they really gave us the most fantastic deal so that we could be full members of the single market without being members of the EU, which is actually what Boris Johnson says, that is the official Boris Johnson position, we want the single market and nothing else. If they gave Britain that sweetheart deal, it would be a bad example, wouldn't it? Because then if the other countries that got annoyed with the EU might also choose that option. And I think, frankly, other member states would simply not agree to give Britain such a deal in case others took advantage of it as well. I think Graham has already explained why the Norwegian model is broken. The key point one of the points that hasn't been made is that Norway, for its access to the single market, does contribute to the EU budget. I guess another paper I'd like to plug by David Buchan, a former FT bureau chief in Brussels. He wrote a paper for us a couple of years ago, Swiss and Norwegian lessons with the EU, and he goes into the figures and shows that Norway pays per capita about half what Britain pays into the EU budget. Switzerland also makes big payments into the budget in return for access to the market. And I don't think the Norwegian model will work because Norway has to accept free movement of labour. for EU migration. And if there's one reason why the British leave the EU, if they do, it's because we don't want EU migrants coming into our country. That is the best argument Nigel Farage has. It's the one that will win the referendum for him if it does. So we would not accept the Norwegian model, because I don't think we would accept free movement of labour if Farage wins the referendum campaign. As for the Swiss, as I think Graham already said, the Swiss model is essentially broken. I mean, the key thing there is it doesn't include services. Switzerland has negotiated these bilateral agreements with the EU for goods, but it has to accept the EU's terms, but it's negotiated to accept the EU's terms. But it doesn't have access to most services, and not, crucially for Britain, financial services. There's no automatic system in Switzerland for adopting EU legislation, EU rules, as there is with the EEA in Norway, which is why the EU doesn't like the Swiss system and would never want to offer it to anybody else. The EU bureaucratic machinery believes that the Swiss system is broken, and there's a real problem now. You may have noticed that about a year ago, the Swiss voted against giving free movement of labour to East European migrants. As a result, Switzerland will lose access to the single market. Parts of it, the EU hasn't decided which bits yet. It's already lost access to the R&D programmes. As for Turkey, the customs union, Turkey does have a customs union. There's no tariffs between the EU and Turkey, but it has to accept the customs levels, the tariffs set by the EU, and just has to accept them full stop. And there's a problem in Turkey with the customs union. The Turks aren't very happy with it, because when the EU negotiated an FTA with South Korea, it meant that South Korea, how it works is, could export whatever it wanted into Turkey's markets. But Turkey doesn't have the right to export to South Korea's markets. It has to negotiate a separate FTA with Korea, which isn't going to happen anytime soon. So most people I speak to in Turkey think that the customs union is not a good deal for them, and Turkey does, of course, not have full access to the single market. Just finally, the bigger picture. I mean, we've talked about mainly about the economics of it, but what we haven't talked about so much is the sort of geopolitical consequences. And as Graham's already quoted David Miliband's point. The article by David Miliband in the issue number 100 of the CR Bulletin really makes the point that everybody in America that he talks to, Republicans and Democrats, say they'll take the UK much less seriously if it leaves the EU, because they find the UK useful in the EU because it shares some of their viewpoints in the world in terms of free trade, free markets, strong defence, strategic thinking. And if the UK is not in the EU, it's less useful for the US, and we're less interested in the US. So we'll have less vacancy, we'll have less influence in the world if we leave. I think that the point I would make is that whether it's you're looking at trade policy or security or financial regulation or climate change, these are big issues that are settled through global negotiations. The EU is one of the big players in these negotiations. If Britain is outside the EU, it won't have a seat at the top table influencing the way the new world order is shaped. So I think, therefore, British influence in the world, whatever the economics, which are bad enough, will be greatly diminished if we leave the EU. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We now have an opportunity for comments and for questions. And please, may I have your comments and questions? May I ask you beforehand to keep them very short so we can get through as many as possible. And at the end, I'll ask our three speakers to summarise. So can I have questions or comments? There's one here, yes? To the...
Thank you. Joe Dilger, Vice Chair, John Adams Society US-UK organisation. First, very quick point, in future, we could have a diversified panel of both men and women. And second point, just in terms of, can you expand, particularly Charles, on the point about how UK will be viewed in the USA if it left the EU, particularly in terms of direct foreign investment? Thank you.
Perhaps we'll take a couple of other questions as well at the same time. This is one in the front here.
Joachim Meinen, European Commission, and therefore a bureaucrat. And Martin's intervention absolutely made me regret being a bureaucrat, at least for this evening. So I'm going to ask the question which he virtually invited. If, as he put it, a referendum is dangerous, pointless and risky, does he think the dangers, the risk and the pointlessness increases with the length of time which might lead up to the referendum? In other words, if we're going to have it, is there an argument for saying let's get it over with as soon as possible? Or does this other argument, which is that it's very difficult to know exactly what the British people would be voting on and for, rather speak to a longer leading time in which some of these issues might be ventilated and better understood by the electorate?
Thank you. I think we'll take those two questions, and Martin, I think you addressed them. Would like to comment first.
I can't resist commenting on the first one, because when you referred to diversity, I thought you were going to go and say, but you all have the same view about Britain and the EU. But it turned out you weren't worried about that at all. You were worried that one of us wasn't the woman. No, that's fascinating. Perhaps next time they should rectify both faults, but I would think the former was bigger than the latter. I just want to comment on your thing. It seems to be pretty clear that there are many companies from around the world, in manufacturing particularly, that have invested in the UK because of its access to the European economy. I don't think this is in any way unique to the Americans. It's clearly true of the Japanese in a very big way. And I think we would have to assume that leaving, and that depends again on whether we're in the single market or not, and the future relationship as they see it. But we have to assume that if we basically leave the single market, which seems to be the only sensible way of interpreting the EU, being inside the single market, the EU strikes me as mad, then that will have a negative effect on our inward investment. It cannot avoid it. On the very interesting question about the uncertainty process, there are two aspects of this negotiation process, and it's important, I think, I didn't have time to go there, but I will now explain what I think will happen. First of all, there's what I think of as the pre-referendum negotiation. This will be a negotiation on terms that are not yet clear, in which the British government, because I presume this will happen under a Conservative government, it's pretty clear that's the condition, in which the British government will go to its partners and say, give us a deal on the reform of the EU, which we can then go back and put to a referendum as the basis on which we argue for staying in. So there will be this negotiation of some kind. I have been in many very high-level international private meetings in which our partners have asked very senior members of the British cabinet what exactly it is they want, and they are finding it rather difficult to find out. But leave aside that little point, that negotiation will have to happen. Now, on the assumption, which I must say is very generous, that the British government will, after the election, know what it wants, even if it doesn't know what it wants before the election, these negotiations presumably have to be sufficiently serious and sufficiently protracted to get a proper agreement that the Prime Minister can go back and say, is the basis of a reformed EU that in his view we should stay in. Now, from my knowledge of the EU and all the other things that are going on in the EU, like the Eurozone crisis, and I won't go on with all the other things, this is not going to be quick. So if we were going to have a serious pre-referendum negotiation, I don't see how that can be done in a year. Now, of course, the government might have many other plans its plan might be to fool the British public completely about a negotiation that never really happened and a deal that doesn't really exist. Who knows? Anything is possible. But the pre-stage seems to me quite significant, and it does seem to me unavoidably it's going to take a couple of years or more in a good day. Then there will be the referendum, on whatever these terms are, and there will be a result. And if we vote yes, then we will have agreed to accept whatever it is that we are being is then the state of play, and we will assume that whatever that is will be ratified. Very good question, which I'm going to leave aside for the moment. But of course, if we vote no, then there will be another negotiation, which will be a completely different one, which will start on what the post-exit alternative is going to look like. Now that will be a completely different negotiation in which we'll have to go through all the possibilities, and I suspect many more, because we will quickly find that quite a few of these are irrelevant. That will also be a very long and uncertain negotiation. So the way I see this is there will be uncertainty about the terms on which the referendum is being proposed by the government. That uncertainty cannot be eliminated until negotiations are completed of some kind, and that will take a while. And then, when we get to the referendum, there will be also be an uncertainty which is ineluctable because it won't have been discussed, it seems to me, which is what the terms would be on which our relations with the EU will be based after we've left. And that can't be simplified, that can't be determined at the time of the referendum because we really won't know. So, unfortunately, I think it would be difficult to have the referendum very quickly because there has to be some negotiation on the terms associated with that. And it's certainly, when we do have the referendum, it won't be possible to know with any certainty what you're voting for if you're voting no. In short, it really is an incomprehensive mess.
Well, Charles, would you like to comment too on this?
I think I'd perhaps pick up the question on the US, because I think Martin's covered that point very well. Let me sort of turn the question round. If Britain leaves the EU, how does that affect the EU? We haven't talked about that. But that is, the answer to that question explains why the US is so worried. I mean, let me suggest 6 consequences if Britain leaves the EU. One thing clearly just destabilises everything. As Martin has explained, the masses of negotiations, EU leaders have to think about how to deal with the British pre-negotiation, post-negotiation. It's going on for years, instead of worrying about serious problems like Russia or the Euro or whatever. So that's one thing, destabilise the EU, and possibly other countries could think about quitting. It just makes it easier to quit if somebody's done it already. Secondly, economic philosophy of the EU. And the British are the biggest champions of the single market, of free trade, and so on. And they always push for it. And everybody expects the British to do that, and other countries hide behind the British in doing so. Without Britain being a member, the EU will be much more introspective and probably mercantilist in its economic philosophy. Thirdly, the British have the best armed forces in the EU alongside the French. We created European defence policy, Tony Blair did with Jacques Chirac, and we are a big player in EU foreign policy. On Ukraine, we've been less big than we usually are, for reasons we can go on to, but despite our absence in Ukrainian diplomacy, we are a major force in EU foreign policy. We are still playing a big role on the Iran nuclear negotiation, for example. Fourthly, the justice and home affairs area. Although Britain opts out from Saudi, we're actually leading it nevertheless. Rob Wainwright runs Europol, a very good British man. The chap who ran Eurojust, the prosecutor's office, was a Brit until very recently. We do an awful lot of counter-terrorism and police cooperation. The British are really in the lead. We feed in more information than any other country to Europol, for example. Fifthly, the German problem. If the British leave, the German problem gets worse. There is a German problem. The Germans have far too much power. They decide a hell of a lot of things. They will be determined in negotiating the terms of the British renegotiation. They decide EU policy on Russia now. They set policy on the euro. Sometimes they have good ideas. I think on Russia they're doing very well generally. Sometimes they have bad ideas like on the euro. But there is a German problem. Everybody else knows it. We're just too polite to talk about it most of the time. But I can tell you, if the British leave the EU, that is terrifying for the French and the Italians because of the preponderance of German power that would result. The most important thing of all, actually, though, is the transatlantic relationship from the American point of view. I mean, the Americans would not like the other changes I've described, but they would certainly, although it is not true that we are the best friend of the Americans in Europe, that is not true. The Americans now see the French as their best friends on security, because the French are a serious military power in Mali and Central African Republic, and in the fight against ISIS, and the British are not. We are simply not serious. We have turned in ourselves post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan. And for economics, of course, the Germans are the privileged partners of the Americans. So the Americans, like Martin, found Germany's economic policies very hard to understand. Nevertheless, there is, despite having said that, we still understand the Americans better than other Europeans, usually, and can help other Europeans to understand what the Americans are thinking and why, and vice versa. We can help the Americans to understand other European positions. So, for all these reasons, the Americans would be extremely unhappy if the British left the EU. And I think we can expect interventions. Obama did make a modest intervention a year ago or 2 years ago, and as the referendum approaches, there'll be more US interventions.
Thank you very much. Can we take some more questions? Yes.
Thank you, Peter Wilder from British Influence. I'd just like to agree with everything Martin said, but also to take issue with two of the things. And I will end with a comment. The first thing is about renegotiation. This is what I understand. I understand that three aspects of renegotiation have already occurred. The first aspect is the Bloomberg speech of 2 years ago, which, as everybody I'm sure in this room, contained 8 demands. Those 8 demands have been signed and sealed, have not yet delivered already. That's in the Council conclusions of June. That means 28 member states have agreed to it already, and in the Commission work programme of Juncker that started. So that needs simply to be delivered, which requires British power to do so. The second thing is over migration. The speech before December has contained a number of conditions, and I understand Frans Timmermans and Number 10 have agreed in principle those terms. The only outstanding thing, therefore, is the repatriation, the third aspect. And I understand from a number of Conservative MPs that that renegotiation will be an attempted repatriation of regional policy. We used because it was originally proposed by Gordon Brown. The treaty change issue is another smoke and mirror exercise. I understand that Number 10 has agreed that the treaty change that they seek will be a minor treaty change and therefore now be subject to referendum, which will be attached, a la Ireland and Denmark, to a subsequent accession treaty. That these negotiations will begin in May, they will be completed in September, and that David Cameron will be announcing this in his Conservative Party conference in September. Now, you may think that's completely ridiculous, but that's what I hear. So it's just fair to say that when people say we don't know what Britain wants, that is not entirely the case. The second and final point that I take issue with is, in the event of a referendum, the public won't know what no or out means. I think that will be part absolutely central to making the binary choice for the British people, that either you have the choice essentially between a Great Britain and a Little England. And so what I said, and I wonder if you would agree with this, please use it in conversation, that if you want out, you will find if you vote for Nigel, you'll end up with no UK, because Scotland leaves, no independent schools, you have to follow everybody else's law, and it will be no party for your kids and grandkids, because even Nigel has accepted that the country will be poorer when we're out.
Thank you very much. And there's a question at the...
Brendan Donnelly from the Clinical Trust.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, Brendan Donnelly from the Clinical Trust. Martin rightly pointed out that there are 2 renegotiations we're talking about. If the result of the first renegotiation is a vote no, that is to say, to leave the European Union, will the members of the panel be pressing for a second referendum on the results of the second renegotiation as well?
Right, well, I think we'll take any other comments at this stage, and then we'll ask our 3 speakers to do a final comment. I've heard that 100... sorry, did I see a question? Yes, there.
Sorry, just a long one.
Can you speak up, please?
Hi, yeah, Gav Rory, a first year student.
Is it switched on?
Yeah, it is. An EVS student, first year from this university. I was just wondering, Charles mentioned how if we left the EU, we would have to keep up a lot of the regulations involved already, like farming subsidies, for example, and therefore it's not quite worth leaving. But can you see reforms being negotiated to strengthen sovereignty of the UK in terms of humanitarian law, specifically lack of freedom to deport?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last bit.
Sorry. I was saying how a lot of the regulations we would keep anyway, which makes sense, but can you see any negotiation between our government and the EU on humanitarian law, like freedom to deport criminals and similar issues? Yeah.
Well, before we answer, and before we take one last question, someone who hasn't put a question, but I'm going to put the question for him, and I was going to ask him, is Sir Conrad Sheeman, who was the UK representative at the European Court for a number of years until recently. And Conrad, I'd heard that if the UK were to leave, the number of treaties which would need to be renegotiated would be about 122. I wondered whether you could comment, as you would understand the process, if what sort of process would this likely to be, where if Britain decided that it was A, going to leave, and B, how would the other member states respond? Can you have a...
There's a wonderful phrase in German, da bin ich überfragt. There I am over-questioned. But it will clearly be one hell of a mother and an awfully long and difficult process. But since I'm on my feet, I rather agree with the fact that it is a pity that pretty well everyone in this room, and certainly everyone on the panel, is all shouting in the same direction. I think you would expect that in a cerebral audience, which university audiences tend to be. The problem is that, certainly amongst my circle of acquaintances, not all of them are all that cerebral, they think that the real question is one of the heart. Do we want to live with these people close to our times, have them make decisions for us, or don't we? I feel that I'm very happy for them to do what they want, but we really don't want to play a part in it. And the difficulty is this, that I think if you come to trying to get any form of agreement with a lot of people, it is always easier to get an agreement against something than an agreement in favor of a positive alternative. I found that very much when negotiating judgments, discussing judgments in the European Court. You always find a majority against any particular proposition, but then the question is, what is the other? Now, I'm afraid that one of the reasons where the instinctive anti-Europeans have a running in this country is that they're arguing for this referendum because that permits the instinctive answer, we don't like the EU, to be given without any concentration on the alternatives. And the challenge for us all, which one seeking to meet in this room, is to try and widen public perception, or alternatively, to get away from putting this question to the public. But I think it's actually now very difficult in this country to get away from it. And it has to be said that if one has referendums as part of the decision-making process of the country, in principle, you couldn't find an issue which is of greater pith or moment. And it is very difficult to argue against it. I find the whole prospect as horrifying as Martin Wolf. But it is there, and we've got to cope with it. I'm sorry not to have answered your question.
I didn't expect you to answer your question. I expected you to explain things in more detail, which you did extremely well. Thank you very much. I think we should probably draw the proceedings to an end with a few comments from our panel here, and perhaps I'll start in the reverse order and ask you first, Graham, if you would like to comment.
Well, I'm going to respond to Brendan Donnelly. If the result of a referendum in the United Kingdom on membership of the European Union is no, then it is absolutely clear that it would be followed by another referendum, namely in Scotland, about Scotland's status. And me, I would vote to accompany that in the referendum on the terms for leaving. The second point I would just like to make is this. It's on this question of what membership of the European Union means. Can you be a half member? One sometimes hears arguments that perhaps this is the idea of the Boris Johnson was. But let me put it like this. Membership of the European Union, it's a bit like pregnancy. Either you're pregnant or you're not pregnant. And as far as membership of the European Union is concerned, the defining point is the right to a vote to have a place in the institutions and a role in decision making. And up to now, the European Union has kept a categorical distinction between membership and non-membership. There's no such thing as partial membership, and there never will be. And I can assure you that the French and others would simply refuse to contemplate a deal where the United Kingdom was a voting member of the single market and not part of the rest of the system. I'm going to conclude by saying, and I return to foreign policy. In foreign policy, influence is power. Power is influence. It's been a central plank of British foreign policy for 200 years or more, to be at the table where decisions are taken. Unless you have overwhelming military force, which we don't, you have to be present when these decisions are taken. Now, that's why leaving the European Union is so risky. Now, I don't believe that the other members, if Britain leaves, I don't think they would be vengeful. They're rational actors. They would want to define a relationship with Britain which would optimise their own interests. So I don't think it would be a question of revenge, but you can be absolutely certain that the decision-making of the European Union of 27 would not take account of British interests. That's what it means to take decisions together. And this problem has been put more crudely in the following way, that if you're not at the table, you may be on the menu. Thank you.
Charles.
Okay, pick a look. I'm not in favour of a second referendum. If the first one goes the wrong way, we leave. Having a second referendum on the terms of the divorce, I don't see the point. I'm sure British diplomats will negotiate the best possible terms available from our partners, and it's kind of irrelevant to have a second referendum. Can we negotiate with our partners to get more sovereignty on humanitarian issues like deporting criminals? We don't have to negotiate with our partners on that. Britain is free under existing laws to deport criminals if it wishes to. There may be an issue with the European Court of Human Rights, which is not the EU, if we deported a criminal to a country where the criminal would claim he was likely to be tortured, that would be a problem. But I don't think torture is common in the EU countries, so I don't think we have a problem deporting criminals from the UK. The main point I want to pick up is Peter Wilding's interesting comment on the latest spin from Downing Street. I mean, ever since the Bloomberg speech of a year ago, two years ago, I've been worried by the excessive optimism amongst Downing Street officials who seem to believe they can get a treaty change. And they say this because their boss wants to hear it. And this is not the first time in British history that this has happened. This has happened, but I remember the vote at the United Nations before the Iraq War. People around Tony Blair told him that we would win the vote at the United Nations to authorise the use of force in Iraq. And we didn't. There is a real problem in the way bureaucracies work. Political advisors in particular, as well as all the officials, have a built-in incentive to tell their boss what they want to hear. And I can tell you that Cameron's been getting advice that there will be a new treaty because, say the officials, the Eurozone is collapsing, or going to collapse, therefore they need a new treaty to save the Euro, therefore they need a British signature, therefore Britain has lots of leverage, therefore we can extract lots of concessions from our partners. And I'm afraid it's all bullshit, it's just not the case. And it really isn't the case, and nobody else wants a new treaty. But the Germans did until about 6 months ago, but because their own relationship with the French is so bad that they don't trust the French. And they know that although the theory in the long run, they'd like a new treaty to improve Eurozone governance, the French would extract the pound of flesh in return for more fiscal discipline, like Eurobonds, or like in the Eurozone budget, or something which the Germans don't want to give at the moment because they're in a nationalistic economic mood and they just don't trust the French. So if the Germans don't want a new treaty, there won't be a new treaty. No, okay, can we not get a so-called post-dated check? The best that the Tories can get, if they win the election, is some statement from the European Council saying, more or less, well, we will change the treaties when we get round to it in the future, and when we do, we'll take on board the following British points, and A, B, C, D. It could be in the form of a protocol, and there is, as you say, Peter, the precedent. After the Danes voted no to Maastricht, there was the Maastricht Protocol of 1992, and when the Irish voted no to Lisbon, there was a Lisbon Protocol to reassure there was some of the Irish protocol to reassure the Irish on abortion, tax and neutrality, which was added later to the Croatian accession treaty. So, I mean, the best that Cameron can get is a bit of paper saying promise of future treaty changes when, you know, maybe when Serbia joins the EU in about 15 years' time, if the world still exists then. And I think Nigel Farage will make mincemeat of that, but I don't see Cameron getting anything better.
Thank you very much. Charles.
I'm just going to make, I agree completely on the second referendum, though I sort of feel it would serve us right. You know, we would make an asinine decision, we'd have an appalling negotiation, we would present it with unsatisfactory terms, and then we can have the option of rejecting them. But there surely is a point beyond a farcicality beneath which even this government does not wish to sink. So I presume we wouldn't do this. So I'll put that to one side. Now the second comment, I'm not going to go into the technical details of the negotiations and how far they're advanced. Charles, I think, dealt with this very well, but I just want to comment on the politics of this. Now, it's not something I should do, at least I do it with a very modest amount of nervousness, because it's not my field. But what I think you're suggesting is, with the agreement by September, is, in essence, nothing will have changed. That matters. So the government will be forced, and I think the government will be forced, to go to the country, because, for example, there will be no controls on the free movement of people. There will be some changes to social security arrangements, but free movement of people will still exist. For example, no powers that matter will be repatriated. No rules that people are concerned about will have been eliminated, in my view. So the government will have to go to the people and say something like, I don't know whether it's going to be a free vote in the Conservative Party, it's going to be fascinating, but something like, we really, really dislike the EU, which we think is a pretty unpleasant place. We have really not changed anything in form, so you should vote in favour of it. Now, that's not what they're going to say, but that's what it's going to amount to. And if I'm Nigel Farage, I'm going to have fun with this, because it's clearly a surrender. But I do agree that if that's the strategy, they can have the referendum quite quickly. And they might win it, because I think a lot of people will be on their side, but it's going to make you very, very nervous if that's the basis for it. So it's what I think of as the confidence trick approach to the whole thing. And confidence tricks sometimes work, and it might be better than the alternative. If that is what happens, then of course we can have the referendum relatively quickly. It will be fun to see how that campaign goes, and then we can, if we do vote no, we can just have a long process of negotiation afterwards, which I hope we won't come to. Now, I just wanted to make one more general point, because the point was made about, you know, the fundamental dissatisfaction of the people with what's happening. Now, I'm going to leave aside the migration issue, because it seems to be what's become salient for so many people, because it's not going to be resolved in this. That's pretty clear. That was one issue on which we were never going to get anywhere whatsoever. Free movement of people is just what's going to happen. But I think there's a more fundamental point to me, and I just sort of like to raise it this way. What the British really liked in the old days was being a free, sovereign, and independent country over a happily or often unhappily divided Europe. That was a very satisfactory state of affairs, at least in the British view, except for the small fact that every century or so we ended up being involved in massive world wars. But let's put that little small problem aside for the moment. Now the problem we have now is that the Europeans have decided, because of that little problem about world wars from time to time, that this wasn't a very satisfactory arrangement for the European continent. In fact, it would be rather more sensible to cooperate very closely, integrate very closely, because there are a bunch of very, very small countries which are right on top of one another and really and truly share almost everything in common. Not everything, but almost everything. So they decided to unify. And this has created, over a 50, 60-year period, a sort of series of heart attacks in the British, because that's not the sort of Europe they want. And my response to that is tough. It's the Europe that exists. And there's a simple choice. You're either part of this Europe, which means you're no longer the Europe of the pits, the Britain of the Pits, or possibly the Britain of Churchill. But you are at least part of this new structure. It recognises the fact, yes, it wasn't an accident that Britain was part of the Roman Empire. We're just that close. We're just that close. And the other possibility is we can be a rather large, but very, very grumpy and miserable, and increasingly, I suspect, grumpy and miserable offshore island. And whenever I hear the people on the other side moaning and groaning about it, I just think that's very, very simply, it's time for this country to grow up.
We've had a very interesting discussion this evening. We admit that from a gender point of view, we didn't get things right. Maybe from producing coherent, intelligent, competent anti-Europeans, we didn't get things right. We searched for both and didn't have too much success. But we do take on board here, as among our values, is very much gender equality. We don't actually go around looking to balance things. We see how they work out. And the senior European experts managed to find, I think, what you'll agree was 3 most interesting people to comment this evening. I have now to thank our Students' Union, because, and if I could ask you to just come forward.
Hi everyone, and thank you all for coming here today. On behalf of the Student Union, for joining us today and giving us insight on this very complex and ongoing UK and EU debate.